Hello, and welcome to Biblical Scholarship Tasks and Challenges. This webinar is the second of 5 that comprise Typologies of Interfaith Education, a symposium co-hosted by the Martin Marty Center for the Public Understanding of Religion and the University of Chicago at the University of Chicago Divinity School and Interfaith Youth Corps, and generously funded by the Henry Luce Foundation. My name is Noah Silverman, and I'm the Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships at Interfaith Youth Corps. It has been my distinct honor and pleasure to work with Professor Wilhelmine Auden, Director of the Martin Marty Center and Professor of Theology and the History of Christianity at the Divinity School, along with Rob Lauren and Rolf Allen to plan the symposium. The goal behind the symposium is to strive for greater communication between administrators, students, and scholars from different seminaries and universities, bridging their religious and political divides by bringing them together for the purpose of developing a more integrated and responsive public approach to interfaith education. As was discussed by David Nuremberg, Dean of the University of Chicago Divinity School, and Ibu Patel, founder and president of Interfaith Youth Corps, at our opening plenary this past Monday, the background to the project is the divided way in which interfaith education is currently being taken up. In today's webinar, we will focus on biblical scholarship and have the pleasure of hearing from an august group of scholars. Before I turn things over to Professor Auden to introduce our panelists, I'd like to inform our attendees that there will be time for an audience Q&A at the end of the webinar. At any time throughout the webinar, please feel free to use the Q&A function in the bottom of your screen to submit questions, and we will attempt to pose as many as possible to our panel before the webinar concludes. Without any further ado, I am pleased to pass things over to Professor Auden.
Thank you, Noah, and welcome to everybody on behalf of the Marty Center as well and the University of Chicago. Before I introduce the August panel, I want to make mention of a terrible shooting that happened last week and at which one of the students at the University of Chicago, a graduate student from China by the name of Yiran Fan, was tragically killed. Right at the moment when we are starting our panel, the university is holding a candlelight vigil in his honor. And although we're kind of adrift on the web or on the internet, I feel that it's very important to mark the concrete place and time, the here and now at the University of Chicago, where we commemorate this student. I'm now beginning to introduce the panel, and it's really a wonderful panel of very distinguished and very diverse scholars, and that really gives me great pleasure, and I think will very much help animate the discussion. I go through the panelists in alphabetical order, and begin with Professor Joel Lohr, who is president of Hartford Seminary. He's a leading interfaith graduate scholar, an award-winning author, and his research is focused on the Bible, specifically the Torah and Pentateuch, as well as Jewish-Christians relations and dialogue. He has published a number of books, both with academic and popular presses. Then we have Professor Richard Newton, who's Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Alabama. His research focuses on what he calls the critical comparative study of scriptures, the New Testament in Western imagination, African American intellectual history, and pedagogy in religious studies. His recent book is called Identifying Roots, Alex Haley and the Anthropology of Scriptures, from 2020. And he's also a founding curator of the online social media professional development network, Sowing the Seed, Fruitful Conversations in Religion, Culture, and Teaching. I then come to Professor Adele Reinhartz, professor in the Department of Classics and Religious Studies at the University of Ottawa. She is the author of numerous books, too many to mention, but I'll mention 2 that hang together in theme: Jesus of Hollywood from 2007 and The Bible and Cinema, an Introduction from 2013. But she's also edited various collections, among which one called The Gospel of John and Jewish-Christian Relations from 2018. She was the general editor of the Journal of Biblical Literature from 2012 to 18 and served as president of the Society of Biblical Literature this past year, 2020. The next panelist is Professor Ross Wagner, who's Associate Professor of New Testament at Duke Divinity School. And he specializes in Paul's letters and in Septuagint studies. He seeks to contribute to the recovery of theological exegesis through careful investigations of the way scriptural interpretation shaped early Jewish and Christian communities. Among his many publications, I want to mention Reading the Sealed Book, Old Greek Isaiah and the Problem of Septuagint Hermeneutics. He's been a Humboldt Fellow in Germany, and he spent 2009-2010 as a member in residence at the Center of Theological Inquiry in Princeton. He's also an ordained minister in the North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. Finally, we have Professor Erin Walsh, assistant professor at the University of Chicago Divinity School. She studies ancient and late antique Christianity with a focus on Syriac language and literature. Her current research focuses on the reception of biblical literature and the growth of asceticism within the Eastern Roman and Persian empires. I happen to know that she's teaching right now a class on comparative asceticism. She's an affiliated faculty member also with the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality and the Greenberg Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Chicago. She also serves as the executive editor for Christianity at Ancient Jew Review, a nonprofit web journal devoted to the interdisciplinary study of ancient Judaism. With the introductions behind me, and I try to highlight a few items on everybody's list that show to the audience how suitable they are as panelists for a discussion on interreligious education. I will now turn it over to Professor Walsh because I've asked her to moderate the discussion.
Thank you, Wilhelmine. It's wonderful to be here with all of you, and I look forward to not only hearing from our panelists, but also eventually bringing in the audience to hear your questions as well. So to begin, I thought we would go around and the panelists just to say a few words about how they approach this topic, what sort of themes in their own work touch upon this, and maybe how they have also developed maybe over the course of their careers in their thought about the issues of interfaith education. So to follow Wilhelmine's order, why don't we start with Joel?
Great. Thank you, Professor Walsh. It's great to meet you all and be part of this panel. I'm honored to participate in it with you, such an esteemed group of individuals. If this is the moment where I should share a few remarks on our theme tonight, I'll just maybe I'll read a few pieces from, as panelists, we were asked to provide a few thoughts on paper for our colleagues to look at prior to meeting today. So I'm going to read a few words from that. I will skip over most of it, but I'm going to read a few things. And I start out in my reflections with a quotation from a scholar at Duke Divinity School, a colleague to Professor Wagner, who I admire a great deal, a fellow colleague in Hebrew Bible Old Testament, Ellen Davis. She says this in a reflective essay on her life. I'm energized by the work in a university where my core assumptions about the nature of the world and human life are not taken for granted, nor even widely shared. I like this situation in part because my own scholarly work is interdisciplinary, but also because the diverse intellectual environment serves as a counter to the dominance of petty disagreements, such as often occur in more homogeneous settings. Putting it another way, the fact that our Christian beliefs are not widely shared among university colleagues keeps us at the Divinity School from taking the truth of the gospel as self-evident. She then goes on to explain how she also feels that working in such a diverse and intellectually stimulating environment produces a level of humility, standing in awe of one's colleagues. I bring that quote to start simply because I'd like to note that in my own setting, I now teach in I no longer teach in a strictly secular setting. I teach in a interfaith seminary, but I find some parallels here in that the ideals hold true. Hartford Seminary, a place where I teach, our diversity lies in a student body and faculty that is diverse religiously and non-religiously. Just to point this out, roughly 40%, 43% this fall identify as Muslim, 31% as Christian, and the remaining from Jewish and other religious traditions. It's a very rich and diverse environment, which I'm very blessed to be part of. And in such settings like this, we can't take for granted that ideas about Scripture or even what constitutes Scripture that these things can be taken for granted. We may have some unity of purpose in our approaching sacred texts, but ultimately we have very different ideas on how we come to the Bible and scriptures more generally. The thing that I'd like to highlight with regard to Davis is that it does bring about a good dose of humility when you're in a room like that and you realize that and there are surprises that are actually quite valuable. Even if I, as a professor or scholar, bring my own set of assumptions about critical scholarship and even about the religious nature of texts as a practitioner myself, it's always interesting to me to see the diverse approaches and questions that come from students. It's not unusual in such a place like this to have students from my Muslim students to say, well, actually in the Quran, Qabil or Cain is said to do such and such, or in the Midrash for a Jewish student, Abraham's father is an idol worshiper, something that's not necessarily clear in the Hebrew Bible, but is clear in Midrash. Or for secular students to question the very existence of a figure named Jesus 2,000 years ago. And such questions are understandable, in my view, should not be discouraged, set aside, and it does really no good to simply say, well, that's not what we're talking about today. In fact, I think that we need to acknowledge our students' perspectives and what they bring in order to engage a more dynamic and bring about a more dynamic learning environment. I won't say a lot more other than I would also say that there's been a lot of discussion, I'm sure we'll get into this in the panel, about the end of biblical studies and the idea that somehow biblical studies can and should be in service of a larger theological agenda or doctrinal work and so on. And I feel the weight of that. And I think it's been good for biblical scholars, myself and my colleagues, to in a sense be put on watch. That we don't have free reign to promote our own religious views in the classroom. It's been a very healthy moment for us. It's not that has happened entirely, but it's been good overall for that to happen. I also feel, though, that the reality of the ways that these texts function as scripture for us force us to grapple with that in the classroom with our students and with our own views as they may come to bear in our assumptions. And sometimes students rightly call us out on how we've made an assumption, and I can give some examples later. But for now, to let others speak, I'm going to pause there and give my time over to my panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Richard, would you mind going next?
Certainly. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be amongst all of you panelists, attendees, IFYC and the University of Chicago Div School. I come to you from the University of Alabama, a public institution in higher education. And I teach a range of classes, including biblical studies courses, but also courses on social theory, African-American religions, race and identity, and a manner of whole other things that they lay on my lap whenever they so choose, and I'm happy to do it. It's why I do what I do. I'm a curious sort in a number of ways. And I think my entry into this conversation, at least for today, will be thinking about what is my own place within the broader discussions around interfaith education, interfaith studies. And there are a lot of ways that I could get into that, except I think today I will choose to sort of speak about my own research and the kind of call it might put forward for the discourse on interfaith studies and interfaith education. My research is on a topic that I like to frame as the anthropology of scriptures. My interest in this for sure started with biblical studies, but was also, again, I'm a curious sort, one that was interested very much in comparison and recognizing confluences as well as contradictions and differences with other texts and with other cultural productions around the world throughout history, ancient, modern, sacred, secular, you name it. And in my thinking about this notion of scriptures, I very much followed Wilfred Cantwell Smith, a noteworthy Islamicist, theologian, early progenitor of interfaith studies in a lot of ways, who was talking very much about scriptures not as an ontology, a sort of a phenomena that is a thing that exists as sacred text in and of itself. But he wanted to look at scriptures as this relational production, something that exists in relationship between people and manifest around text to great effect. So he was very much interested in the anthropology of scriptures, which is what I see myself as investigating further. I think where I depart from Cantwell Smith is that I don't think that the relationships that we see around texts necessarily are potent and powerful because they evoke the divine. I think human beings are very, very creative with what they can do with text and other cultural productions. What I think we see happening with this phenomena of scriptures, anthropologically speaking, is that scriptures or these texts exist at the fine line between making difference on one hand and our aspirations for making a difference on the other. So that fine line between making difference and making a difference in the world is where we often see these cultural productions that we call scriptures at work, deployed to great effect. It's a source, a place where we often see people taking root and making sense of their identity and who they are in relationship to other people, how they read others, and how they try to map those people within a shared space. And I'm interested in the ways in which people learn to do that and then unlearn how they are actually doing that. So, in the classroom, the way this looks is, students will make a statement or a pronouncement about what the text says. Though were you to take those same dynamics and apply them to a different text or different set of conditions, they say, well, that's a completely other thing. And it's like, well, why is it another thing? How do we draw these lines? How do we parse the differences that are at play here? I want to help students and other interlocutors adopt a sort of vocabulary and grammar for talking about these very dynamics. I think what this contributes to discussions of interfaith education and interfaith conversation and collaboration is that idea that we have to look at how we learned to arrive at the solutions we're bringing to problems, as well as how do we learn to identify the problems that need transcending. My thinking here is that often what's happening around scriptures is not so much transcendence, though we may claim and have great reason to claim as much in our own experiences, but when we start looking at the social relationships that are happening around these texts that are being brokered, we're seeing a lot of transgression. And those transgressions, can be transcendent for others. I often think of this in terms of W.B. Du Bois's thought about, what does it feel like to be a problem? When do people become problems? Why do people think they have solutions? And what books or texts or media do they consult in order to say, it told me so and I told you so? It's in relationship to those dynamics with scriptures that I think we have a lot to learn when it comes to interfaith education, not just about the possibilities, but also the problems that face us, because it's a very, very politically charged project. And speaking from someone who teaches at a public university, my job is to create a space for us to engage those problematics far before we get to the aspirations. If I can create a classroom setting where, sure, we're going to talk about things that matter greatly to us, whether we know it or not, and matter to others. If we can do so knowing that we'll probably get offended, but no one is oppressed, then I think I've done a good day's work. But that's a really hard task. And I think that's the first step that I try to do. And it's a reminder for me, and I think those engaged in interfaith studies, that we can't put the cart before the horse. And so my contribution is to help us get that sequence perhaps in order as best as we can.
Thank you. Adele?
Yeah, thank you. I'm also very happy to be here. It's nice to be able to travel, at least in the spirit, if not in fact. And my thoughts around this topic are in response to an aspect of the prompt that we were given in order to reflect today, which had to do with how we understood the relationship between ourselves as biblical scholars and as people, perhaps practitioners in particular traditions. And I responded to this out of the kind of my own social location, which is a social location of dissonance between those two identities. And that's what I'm navigating all the time in my academic life. In my teaching life, I actually don't teach Bible at all. I teach religion, and mostly on the graduate level, theory and method and things like that. But certainly as a participant in the field, I'm very much a Jewish New Testament scholar. And there you already have the sense of the dilemma. In posing such a question, many people assume that those of us who teach in this field are teaching the scriptures that are canonical or sacred in our own traditions. And of course, for Christians, in a sense, their scriptural tradition encompasses, what's called Old Testament and New Testament. But for Jews, that's not the case. And so in my own case, I'm a specialist in the scriptures that are not canonical in my own tradition, and to which I personally don't accord any spiritual authority, religious authority, or any authority of any sort. And so, I was just thinking through, it's a good opportunity to think through some of the ways in which I think my stance towards my subject, the subject matter that I study, might be different from that of other colleagues whom I know. We all have a range of identities, and I don't want to assume that every other New Testament scholar, is going to church every Sunday or is actively involved with that. But I do know many people who are like that. And so in the first place, for me, the New Testament really is only an academic interest. I'm passionately interested in it, but I live the rest of my life without reference to it. It's not a touchstone for me in any way outside of my scholarly interests, which of course are very important to me. So I spent a lot of time thinking about it. Secondly, there's no level at which I'm drawn to the message or to the main character of, to Jesus or to the Gospels or the letters of Paul or anything like that. I do know Jewish New Testament scholars who do feel drawn that way, not in the sense of wanting to convert to Christianity, but because they find the figure of Jesus to be compelling, or there are other reasons that they feel personally kind of compelled by these texts and by these figures. But I'm just not like that. And I'm okay with that. I often run into people who aren't okay with me being that way, but I'm okay with it. And if as many people have said, if I were a mathematician, I wouldn't feel called upon to identify as a triangle, So I think it's fine to be able to study a particular field without feeling personally called in a spiritual way to that. And but the third aspect is maybe the most problematic, and that is because the New Testament itself is implicated in the development of anti-Semitism. And it's at that level that I really study it. That's not how I began. I did my graduate work in the 70s and early 80s at a time when we were doing, or thought we were doing, objective scholarship. And also at a time when I personally was both naive and secondly, overly optimistic about the efforts of people like my own thesis supervisor, Ed Sanders, to kind of overcome the anti-Judaism that was still prevalent in the textbooks that we were reading and so on. And I was kind of had this positivist attitude that all of this would be put aside and really it was no problem. That's really not the case. And as a, not only as a Jewish New Testament scholar, but all of us who study New Testament really have to grapple with this issue. And it's become one of my own main concerns, especially in conjunction with political events in the United States and the ways in which, white supremacist movements are both racist and anti-Semitic and kind of all those things wrapped up together. So I think maybe that's all I will say about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Ross.
Thank you. Well, I'm also grateful for the chance to be part of this discussion. My own context is one that I find confusing and also a lot of fun. So at Duke, I'm part of the graduate program in religion faculty that sits in the graduate school. I teach in the Divinity school. I get a chance to teach undergraduates sometimes. And in all of those very different contexts, I'm teaching similar texts and ideas. And so one of the things that has come to the forefront as I've been thinking about this topic is the tension between being in all of these different contexts and conversations and trying to be one person. And so if I can just reflect personally a little bit, I find it's a kind of frustration and confusion that is also energizing. For me, the problem that Dr. Reinhardt's just mentioned, the ways in which the New Testament has been weaponized in anti-Judaic, anti-Semitic ways, is a problem that I face in the context of being a human being, an American citizen, but also it hits very close to home as somebody charged with teaching future ministers. There's a context in the Divinity School where issues around the anti-Jewish interpretation of the New Testament have to be taken deeply seriously, have to be owned in terms of history, have to be faced in terms of repentance, and we have to think about, and we're still going to be preaching these texts on Sunday, so what kind of practice is more in keeping with not only the what's more humane, but also what's more faithful to the Christian tradition. And I think those who teach scriptures from within the traditions, whether Jewish or Muslim or Christian or another tradition, are always caught in needing to find some distance from the text in order to have an encounter with another, but also feeling compelled to shoulder responsibility for interpretation, one's own and the community's own interpretations. Charles Cosgrove talks about readers and interpreters becoming co-accountable with the text for its meaning. And for someone who situates himself in a religious tradition, there's a sense of being accountable not only to one's own personal integrity, but also to a larger community, and seeking in teaching these texts to shape a better practice. I also think that there are many goods for those outside a particular religious tradition, and seeing how adherents of one or another tradition wrestle with these kinds of problems. Some of the most enlightening struggles that I have witnessed have been in the tradition of Islam, thinking about how to understand its own scriptures, its own practices in light of pretty radical elements in the community. And Christians don't have to look far, as Dr. Reinhardt was saying, just in present day, people waving Jesus flags and quoting Bible verses. So I think that the challenge of being personally implicated in reading is one that doesn't really ever let up. And I say it's frustrating because there seem to be so many problems and questions. It's also exciting because these texts have, at moments in the past, broken free of bad interpretations and led to the creation of new forms of life that are more humane, that serve human flourishing. I think just to return to a note that Professor Lohr mentioned, humility in interpretation seems to be one of the chief virtues. It isn't hard to find if one is attentive to the complexities of the process.
Wonderful, thank you. And we're going to run this more as a conversation, but maybe just to kick things off, I was wondering if people could offer, the panelists could think out loud about what are principles of your own pedagogical practice. I think, listening, I was struck when Richard was talking about what we have to unlearn. And that resonates with a lot of my own experience in the classroom, that these are texts that students feel are both very familiar to a certain degree, either from popular culture or coming from religious traditions. What sort of principles do you think about within your own classrooms and syllabi, and maybe also how that has changed as you've moved to different teaching contexts. So I'll just open it up to whoever wants to chime in. Yeah, Ross.
I'll start in part by way of inviting you, Erin, to say something about what you wrote for us. I love the way you put this, so I'll try not to steal your thunder. Wanting students to realize that an opinion that they give or report has a history. Yeah. And I think that certainly within the context of the Divinity School is really important to me, that students understand that their readings of Scripture don't just come out of nowhere.
Right.
People are formed to read in a particular way. Would you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I feel that I work within the field of biblical studies, but I feel my research and my key questions are about the reception and the traditions, plural, that have been built upon these texts. So I'm constantly thinking about how flexible and how the creativity that these texts have inspired, the creativity it's inspired. So I often, at presenting a particular biblical text, will read a text through early Christian authors with them, presenting them. And, my colleague, Dr. Margaret Mitchell, has a great practice of having students actually inhabit the different interpretations of different figures, both modern scholars, but also ancient readers of Scripture as well. And I think having to inhabit someone else's views, having to argue from their point of view, is a way of showing how these interpretations are constantly being renegotiated. And I would also say that I think biblical literature is especially open to thinking through the traditions that have built upon it, whether it's the Syriac tradition or the Greek or the Latin literature that I'm constantly working with. I feel as a historian of the early church, I'm often trying to show students that there are multiple voices at every point, that there's not a monolithic viewpoint. And I think they can carry that towards the modern day as well. So I often will be talking about multivocal traditions is how I usually frame it.
I think one element that I try to incorporate in the classroom, this is not specific to biblical studies, but I think it happens very much so in biblical studies in my New Testament course, for instance, because of our assumptions about texts. And that is that the dynamics that we see happening in texts with characters, with figures, and the people who produce these texts are just as complicated and layered as the dynamics that we live by every day. Like, it's not like somehow people in the past were just stupid and simple. And I think that's a really difficult lesson for students to grasp at times, because they know that verse A means B. They've learned a sort of mathematics that approaches the text that way. Whether it's of their tradition or it's of traditions of people, it's of people who come from traditions around them can do that to great effect. They know there's some power there that needs to be understood. And if you don't understand that, there are penalties for it. What I try to do is sort of slow down the process and help students recognize the complexities that happen within the text, around the text. I often talk about this in terms of reading the New Testament as both as text, as artifact, as social world. And in making our claims about what's going on in all of those spaces, can we do that in a way that someone else can read what we've done and say, that makes sense to me? They don't have to agree, but I want someone else to be able to say, that is a valid rationale for your claim. Like, I understand how you got from there to there. That work for my students is, it seems to keep them busy. It definitely keeps me busy. And I think what is fascinating is both how they do these things with an increasing amount of tools. When they're reading more and more and more, they have more to draw upon, but also the way they get back to very simple principles about interpretation and social engagement and those things that we never know where the lessons come from, but we try to stay open to it and realize that we don't have it all figured out. That's when the class really gets going.
I'm going to jump in if I may. I just am thinking of you talked about principles of pedagogy, and just when you think you figured out a few things in pedagogy, you realize you haven't figured as much out as you might have hoped. And one of the things I think is really important, and I'm sure we all do it, but you have to be intentional about it and continually intentional in updating your readings. But I think with readings and with some of the materials you're helping your students get into that they might not otherwise get into in terms of perspective, you want a diversity of readings and ways of approaching texts. And so you start collecting your different ways in which you're going to approach topics, whether they be topics or hermeneutical principles or certain passages, or if you're looking at a particular book or a set of books, maybe Torah or whatever. You try to encourage a diversity of perspectives in terms of maybe post-colonial studies and feminist work, and have a variety of, make sure that your documents aren't all by straight white Christian males or something, and you really try to encourage that diversity. What I found interesting is in coming to a setting like where I am, and this in terms of, you can often find a lot of Jewish and Christian interpretation of Hebrew scriptures, for example, so you can include various ways of approaches. But what I found most surprising is to be in a classroom where you have questions coming from those who don't share either of those perspectives, but have a certain level of respect for the text under study, and in some ways may even have a higher level of respect than, or at least a higher, I don't know if I want to gauge things in terms of some kind of level, but it's very interesting to have concern from a Muslim student that we're not treating the text with enough respect, even though it might not be their first or primary sacred text, and to see a Christian reader, to just, well, don't you see Jesus as a divine? Well, and we have a lot of liberal Christians who might look at things differently. So when you get a discussion going, it can be very dynamic. And I feel like I don't have enough readings yet in my sort of quiver, I guess, of Muslim. There are some out there, but it's a very interesting perspective. And to Professor Reinhardt's point earlier about how these texts have inspired violence and anti-Semitism, and that they themselves exhibit those things, anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. One area that I confess I have not spent a lot of time on or given a lot of thought to until my current setting, which is the ways in which the Hebrew Bible contributes to a particular view on the Middle East within the text. And, there are certain things we do pedagogically. We might say, well, let's bracket a few discussions right now for the sake of engaging this text more fully. We don't want to get into a modern day debate around Middle East, but we're just going to look at this text. But it's very hard sometimes when a student keeps hearing the land of Israel, the land of Israel, the land of Israel, and hears it read in a certain way. And, to challenge it and then have a student immediately say, I thought we weren't going to get into politics in this class. And I say, we're not talking politics right now in this class. We're talking about an ancient Hebrew text. But for them, there's still, we're in different places in how we look at a text and what it's presenting. And it may be more real and immediate than I am, kind of has this distance from this as a historical literary text. So I'll pause there because I think I want to make sure Professor Reinhardt gets in. I just saw you on mute, so I'll let you go.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to respond to that. I think that ultimately you can't get away from politics, and that even when we're teaching ancient texts, I emphasize that they're also within a certain political context. There are social contexts, historical contexts. We're good at that, right? Because that's historical criticism. We can do all that. But there are also, we all know this, right, points of view. And those points of view are often what we might call political. And, you've got Davidic, if you think about the Hebrew Bible, you might have a pro-Davidic source or an anti-Davidic source, and a pro-monarchy and an anti-monarchy and anti-judges and, all the rest of it. And so stories are told through very specific perspectives. And I think it's helpful to highlight that. And then also not to ignore, what Aaron was talking about earlier, the whole history of reception, that none of us, no matter what, comes to the text in an unfiltered sort of way. I mean, maybe that's not true. I think that I have encountered students who absolutely have never heard of these texts before. They're taking a course. This is, when I used to teach Bible, they're taking this course because they needed a second-year course, and it's a it can fill a slot for them, and they don't really care about it, and they don't really know anything about it. And, and there they are. And maybe they come to it without any prior knowledge whatsoever. But that's not true of many of our students. And even students like that who say they don't know anything about it, well, they maybe have watched, the 10 Commandments, or, maybe gone to an art gallery and seen certain artworks, or, gone to the movies and heard certain Bible verses quoted without knowing where they're from, and absorbed certain attitudes. So I think the political aspect is very important. But I was just thinking, as everybody was talking, that, I've already mentioned that I don't actually teach Bible right now, just a quirk of our, how things pan out. And I'm sure I will do so at some point in the future. But I do teach film. I teach religion and film. And I have actually found that teaching that course on religion and film has been much more effective for interfaith dialogue than anything I ever did in Bible. And it was very interesting to me. I didn't go into it with that kind of sense at all. But when I began teaching this course, in particular, religion and cinema, but I have found it to be very effective because I teach films from all kinds of different cinematic traditions in different parts of the world. And those end up being vehicles for conversations around interreligious dialogue and attitudes, and create an environment where students can enter into each other's stories in a much more visceral way than when we're reading biblical texts. And I would just want to say that, that sometimes the vehicles that we think can promote certain conversations aren't the ones best suited to that. Sometimes there are other vehicles that are actually more effective for our particular student bodies.
And I think too that often what happens in sort of intercommunal discussions, I'll say, because I don't think it necessarily happens solely around religion, but we know the history of it around religion, and it's prominent for us, is that there's a lot of engagement and interpretation by proxy that is worth registering if we're trying to cultivate certain types of conversations, or if we're weary of other kinds. And what comes, a couple of things come to mind here for me that I think are two sides of the same coin. I think, Joel, you mentioned at one level that the sort of engagement of the Muslim student with the biblical text and the role of revering the text to me is quite fascinating, because I wonder, well, what is the sort of mutuality benefit that comes from articulating a sort of sense that the text needs to be revered, not only for that student, but for others involved in the conversation? And what does that do for someone who is very much like, we need to be very careful about, idolatrizing the text or revering the text, someone who wants to maintain a sort of, whether it's a methodological agnosticism or a well-informed historical defense against someone using a book against them. And the other side of the coin for that is something that happened here in Alabama, and that is when the State House wanted to put in the 10 Commandments. And I was asked by a radio host from NPR about what I thought the sort of implications would be for sort of other religions being able to be represented in the State House. The reason being that the rationale behind why it was okay for the 10 Commandments to be present was because it was historical and not religious. And what I had to remind the host is that it's only historical when they say it's historical. it's religious when they say it's religious. And who's the they and when's the when is something that we need to unpack. And we know how this works in the history of religions quite well. And to build on what Adele said, yeah, like not only is the medium of our vehicles not always what we think it is, but the persons who are subjects and objects as well, and the relationships that are being developed around these texts and media. And I think that's what makes the possibilities around interfaith and interfaith education so complicated, I'll say.
One of the tools that's been helpful to me in teaching students to think about the co-accountability for interpretation, or the ethics of interpretation, is a framework that Daniel Platt, a New Testament scholar emeritus now at Vanderbilt, developed. He calls it Scriptural Criticism, but it's basically an intentional distancing of oneself from the text in order to own that there's a particular present context, and there are a set of convictions, problems, there's an interpretation of the world. And all three of those are involved in an interpretation. And in teaching this, one of the things we do is first, look at other people's interpretations and try sympathetically and critically to say, well, what questions did this person bring to the text? What was the interpreter's social location? How was that helping them, but also maybe closing off their point of view? But then students progress to doing that to themselves as well. So how do I own my own role in this interpretation? And the value of that for me as a professor has been to, at least when I'm on, to constantly be conscious of my own commitments and fears and aims, so as to create some distance, I think, between my role as professor and my students, that I don't speak ex cathedra. I'm struggling as well to be a good reader of these texts. And that's fairly simple exercise of just naming the fact that there's no uninterested interpretation, I think has been a practical way of drawing in some of the things that Richard was just talking about, that in all of our interactions with these texts, we have to own the fact that we're involved in relationships that go far beyond that one single act of reading.
Another question that I had, maybe to reflect together on, do you think that there are ways that biblical studies is structured as a field, and maybe ways that biblical scholars are trained that either could change in ways that would promote interfaith education, or what would you like to see? And it's a large question, but maybe to think out loud a bit.
Yeah, maybe I'll just begin some thoughts on that. And of course, I was trained a long time ago, and so one hopes that maybe things have changed, or 50, 45 years or so. But it seems to me, that many of us who've gone through a PhD program in biblical studies don't really deal with religion, and we don't see ourselves, even those of us that did this in the context of a religious studies department, let's say, we're asking different kinds of questions. There are different sorts of methodologies, and it can be easy in let's say in a secular public university, like the ones I've always been in, to ignore the fact that there are religious practitioners, or that these texts have consequences in people's real lives and in history. I think maybe that's beginning to change, but you see some of that. And then it becomes difficult to, think about the relationship between theology and what we call, critical biblical scholarship. And this is something that I've been attentive to because it comes up all the time in New Testament studies, and certainly in studies on Johannine studies, Gospel of John, etc., which is where I spent most of my time. That when people are, so on the one hand, there isn't often a recognition that there's a theological element to things, but at the same time, theological views often masquerade as history. So people say that they're doing history, but they're actually doing theology because they're allowing their theological views to shape their interpretation of the text. Now, maybe that's okay, and maybe that's inevitable in our recognition that there really is no such thing as objective scholarship. But it's still something that bothers me when people make an argument that such and such cannot be an interpretation because it goes against what my church has to say. And sophisticated scholars do this surreptitiously. It's kind of like surreptitious theology masquerading as history. And so I think that there's a problem on all sides when it comes to trying to take into account the relationship between biblical studies and theology, Christian theology.
If I may, I'm going to add on to that. And you've asked about the field as a whole and how we are trained. I would say one of the things that I found most helpful about the training I received is that I'm guessing fairly standard for how these things are done, but you start off, if you're going into biblical studies, at some point you need to have efficiency in reading Hebrew and then reading Greek and additional texts. And so you start out with languages, and that in itself is a disorienting process. You especially for us as monolingual, people in North America, for the most part, the idea that there are different words, all of a sudden, if you are new to these things, you look at a Bible text and what do you mean this word, might not mean what I thought it meant. And even just those revelations you have. I still remember thinking to myself that Hebrew wasn't, a language until, if these texts are purporting to report, events of 5,000-6,000 years ago, if Hebrew wasn't developed until 1800 BCE, how is it possible that these characters have Hebrew names, and these names are all quite mythic in their orientation in terms of Havel, breath or vapor, this Abel who is wiped out, or Noah as relief, or these names of Genesis in particular just kind of struck me. And so you're learning languages, you're being disoriented through the languages. Then if your teachers are doing their job, they're letting you read critical text, and you have a whole apparatus at the bottom of every page that tells you, well, one manuscript says this, and before you know it, your whole world is starting to fall apart in some respects if you view this as a very sacred text. And if you come from a lot of people's background in North America, certainly America, from an evangelical perspective, where these texts are not only authoritative, but they may have some level of inerrancy or without error. And you start realizing that whole idea is very hard to hold up, or at least it's challenged in significant ways. And then you get into rhetorical criticism, and you start realizing, well, wait a minute, these texts were never really written down. They were originally oral texts. When I read James Watts's book, Reading Law, and came to realize that these books are better understood as oral texts. And if you listen to them as opposed to read them, you're going to learn more about how they were understood in the ancient world than reading them. And then if your professors are doing a good job, you're going to get into comparative studies and into feminist studies, post-colonial studies. You're going to start looking at all of these things. So I think the field overall does a pretty good job on some of those things that help disorient us from our moors, which is hugely important in any study, not just biblical studies. But where I worry is maybe going back to something Professor Reinhardt's brought up. I don't know if you're saying this, but I would say this. I don't know that we are very well trained in religious studies as biblical scholars all the time. I don't think my experience, if it's anyone else's experience, and I sense this with others, is that we're not really that great at religious studies or understanding religious communities and really having a handle on that, because we've spent so much of our energy and time looking at doing textual work. And so I think it's a hole that we should probably try to plug, or at least look at and ask questions about. I don't have solutions on that, but I realized my inadequacies when I tried looking more intently later in my academic life at religious studies and trying to have a handle on this. I had a little bit of comparative studies, but usually the comparative studies are like Josephus and New Testament. It wasn't really comparative studies in a true religious study sense. So I'll pause there, but I think it's an important point.
It's a funny question for me because I am, and I've talked with some of you about this. I mean, at times I am too religious studies or too anthropology or too this for biblical studies. In other spaces, I'm too biblical studies for this field, that field, or another field. I've made peace with that. I sleep okay at night. But I am fascinated about how those determinations arrive. And through graduate study and through the sort of professorate, the thing that I've arrived at with why people come to such conclusions about me is because they presume that to be a scholar means to be a certain kind of expert, to be a sort of teaching expert professor of a certain corpus in a certain way that furthers knowledge on a thing. I think that when we start looking at experts as people who are planning their own obsolescence with their students and with their conversation partners, then the field starts to change really quickly. And it is not only more disorienting, but we embrace a certain sort of disorientation because we know questions lurk there. And in biblical studies in particular, I think what I see is some possibilities for the field. Maybe people won't like this. I'm okay with that too. But I'm interested in what people would say about this, is that we need to be clear about asking students and ourselves, what tasks are we interested in? Like why are we studying whatever it is we're studying? I don't know if we'll ever know the answer. Like, I don't know if there's the reason why I study John is because of X. Like, I don't know if that's ever the case. Maybe it's for someone else to identify. But what do we think is sort of leading us or directing us in one way or the other? If only to ask ourselves then about, well, what sort of tools do I need for that job? The job of doing that task, so that someone else recognizes what I'm doing and I can engage in conversation with them too. And then as a teacher expert, what questions does that bring about that I can't currently answer that I hope to answer or train someone to help me better see? I think when we do this, we'll reevaluate what languages are important. I think we'll reevaluate what texts are important. I think we'll reevaluate what bibliographies are important. You know, if I have to be asked via email or social media about what Black Bible scholars doing X, I will get frustrated and not be able to sleep at night because I will be so mad. I read Bultmann too. Why didn't you read, these other people? I had to read all those canonical figures. Why didn't you? And if you haven't asked that question, then maybe that's the problem. And it's not just in biblical studies, it's in all matter of human inquiry. But when we think that the possession of a book or a language or a tool means that you know and have something that someone else just can't, I think we're going to get into trouble. People can do so many things with so little. We probably wouldn't be talking about the Bible in the United States were it not for people who did so much with the Bible, knowing very little of the things we say we're experts in. That we might need to reconsider what are the tools and tasks and even possibilities for a field that would call itself biblical studies. It's not that we need to get rid of or stop learning anything. I'm not on that train. But what else might we learn? And maybe what can knowledge from one domain teach us in another? I think philology has a lot to teach the political, and vice versa.
All right. Well, one thing that I think, Richard, you brought up speaking to NPR, and I was curious, also listening to Adele speaking about film and religion. It seems that one of the places that we've all talked about in terms of the political is the public scholarship, and whether we can talk about in terms of biblical studies and graduate programs, to what degree do we prepare students to be public scholars? But in terms of interfaith education, maybe raising the religious literacy, the historical literacy of our communities, what do you think the relationship, how do you think that those of us within divinity schools and universities, how do we best reach a popular audience? How, what are the pitfalls, maybe your own experiences, how we can initiate it, and maybe change a bit?
I think this will sound like the counter to what I just said, but I think a lot of biblical scholars and exegetes in particular could be really adept at helping people understand how law works. Like, I think that there's a proficiency, not necessarily just in the specific text, but how texts work, how interpretations work, that could be really instructive and informative for the public to think about other corpuses of texts. I run into a lot of lawyers who talk about hermeneutics and what they've learned from biblical hermeneutics. From people who really don't know that much about, like, they read a chapter in a textbook and then they're talking about, in biblical studies, they do this thing with interpretation that would be really interesting in law. And I'm like, what if they had someone from a seminary help them think through constitutions and amendments in the way, like, I think there's a lot that could be done there. I think that maybe the one place to go is to say that biblical studies has far more to say about the human than just stuff related to the Bible. But our familiarity and proficiency in study and history with the Bible helps us raise questions about these other things too. I think that's one possibility.
Something you just said really resonates with me, Richard. Although most of my teaching is in a divinity school, where there are a whole set of conversations around the Bible that are kind of set by the tradition. I a couple summers running taught ancient Roman religion in Italy to Duke undergrads, and I realized that the sorts of things I wanted them to learn by paying attention to artifacts and texts and context these were skills. I mean, a couple of my students have gone on to law school, for example, how to observe closely, how to distance the moment of judgment from the moment of observation, how to make an argument around a text. All those kinds of skills are broadly applicable to any humanistic endeavor. And I'm not sure biblical scholars are uniquely qualified to teach those skills. A good classics professor will be inculcating the same things. I guess I think that the extra that a biblical scholar can offer is, at least publicly, is again back to this notion that interpretations have histories, that texts and readings arise out of communities, jockeying for political power, trying to figure out the significance of the world. Richard, in your statement, you talked about the idea of creating a usable past as one of the tasks and one of the dangers of working with texts like this. And I think in terms of recent political upheaval in the United States, I've really appreciated hearing from colleagues, some of them writing in very public places, as biblical scholars, offering a little bit of a detached and distanced take on what is going on when people use scripture. I think that's just as incumbent on people who identify with religious traditions as well, to talk about what makes for good interpretation, what makes for dangerous interpretation. But given that these biblical texts in particular are fraught for our culture in a way the Aeneid just isn't, I think there's, again, a kind of an ethical responsibility. The SBL has been working the Bible Odyssey, just offering an online repository of really good information. That's one, I think, very significant thing. How we each might be involved in that differ in many ways.
I'm going to just very quickly thank Professor Newton and Wagner, both of you, for bringing this up, because I think it's really, really important. And I would say that I talked a little bit about the process of biblical studies and becoming a scholar, but really I also was a double major in my undergrad in philosophy, and I feel like I learned more in philosophy, taking logic, informal logic. I mean, God help me with Copey and Cohen, that textbook, but I struggled through the philosophy. But I learned so much about text and argument and ideas and how to think about bracketing one's perspective in order to engage subjects more fully. And I, one of the greatest privileges, recently now I'm, do a lot of administration in higher ed and interact with legal counsel and, draft letters for them and they review them. And it's always a pleasure when you get something back from a lawyer and they say, I actually don't have anything to change on this. And I can't say I've ever had that before. And it's a huge compliment for them to say, I just appreciate your perspective on this. It's not like they're asking, did you study law? But you get the impression they're like, you really wrote a good document here because you could see both sides of this. And I think that helps in how we read newspapers, how we look at arguments right now. One of the greatest privileges in learning philosophy is that when you hear an argument that you disagree with, you always have to try your best to build up that quote unquote opponent's argument better than it currently is, because they may have their own little blind spot, but you want to take it on its best possible framework, not reduce it and create a straw person or something. So philosophy, I think these are hugely important assets that biblical scholars can have. We don't always have. I don't know if I did, if I hadn't taken the philosophy I did, I don't know if I would have the same, framework to work from. And I don't know if we're doing a good enough job, but I do think we're doing a reasonable job. I don't know.
Maybe at this point, I can come on and ask some questions from the audience. It was a little slow at the beginning, but now the questions are coming in. So let me take a few. So one question is from George Hyder from Valparaiso. How can we best acknowledge abuses within each tradition, like oppressive versions of Zionism or supersessionist versions of Christianity or violent Islam, while leading our students to see the distinctive contributions that each tradition brings to the world?
I will just comment on that. I think that's one of the challenging aspects of the field. But, my own approach is to kind of comment that every tradition has its uplifting or, spiritually nourishing elements, and also its problematic elements. And these might be elements that are problematic sort of within the historical context in which these texts were written, or they might be elements that have become so through the history of reception and interpretation. And I think that's an important fundamental point, because what we see, we've seen since 9/11, the tendency of people to interpret Islam entirely through the lens of one or two particular points that are emphasized, that they saw somewhere in some op-ed or social media. And the same is true also in the arguments around Zionism and the kind of very lively and problematic discussion around that today, as well as, of course, supersessionism. So I think that it's, I think what we need to always inculcate when we're teaching is a stance of respect towards our own tradition and also towards the other traditions. And to discourage or to call out the move towards stereotyping or the move towards seeing a tradition only in light of the one or two snippets that might be circulating on social media, to help them understand the complexity. So that allows you both to both see elements that are problematic within our scriptures and within our traditions of interpretation, but also to contextualize that in a more complex way, and hopefully to hold people back from generalizing from that one point to the entire community or the entire set of scriptures.
Is there anyone else who would like to comment on this question? Otherwise, if not, then I'll go to the next question, which was actually a question that two people asked independently. What is your take on the role of biblical studies in 21st century America, both for higher education and for the public in general? What challenges do you see in particular? In fact, the two versions were, the one question was really about the 21st century. The other version was, what about biblical scholars in the next decade? So there's a short-term and a long-term perspective.
I mean, I think, I won't say whether this is a good or a bad thing, but I do think there is a calculus that needs to be teased out with the push toward public scholarship and biblical studies often looking like adjudicating what is the proper interpretation versus the improper interpretation of a text. I think that is a fascinating game that could lead to other sorts of ends than a lot of interpreters think. And what I mean here is that the rush to make a statement that X, Y, or Z is a misuse of a scriptural text. Now, it's a use of a scriptural text by a community for certain ends, and they are just as faithful as the people who are going to argue otherwise. How and why that works and what difference that should make for a common populace is another question. And so I get really nervous when I see my colleagues say, oh, what they did with Paul was just not good, and no one should pay attention to that. I think we can say the action they did with the use of Paul was probably something that had a body count. I think that makes sense. We can see how they used Paul to get to that body count or to get to those wounds or get to that damage or why that's problematic. But I think there's a difference between saying we control the right text because of our expertise and knowledge, and they are wrong and we are right. And I think that's, I want to see biblical studies end or become something that's going to be a tool for means that probably are against what a lot of people are interested in when it comes to interfaith, keep that up. But if we want to do something quite different, I think some of what has been raised, like the complexities of what my colleagues here have raised, are really, could be really fruitful. I don't know what ends, but I think it's ends worth working toward. If only because it keeps us honest. So
I'm going to jump in on that, but the point I was probably going to make is not far from some points that Professor Walsh made in her conclusion to her reflections, and she's been so kindly moderating. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about your the idea of detached spectators, that these aren't detached spectators, and for that reason, we have a future of biblical studies. But I'll let you speak. I really appreciated your words there.
As well as Richard was talking, I was thinking a lot about, I don't want to be the person who's saying, well, I think we also have to study other periods, and the period that I particularly focus on is late antiquity. But I do find that when I teach the history of Christianity, I teach it as an ongoing debates about interpretation, exactly what Richard was saying. And when I did a course on the Council of Nicaea, each student was assigned a role at the second day of class. And at the end of the class, we reenacted Nicaea, and I saw students who began the class having never read the New Testament, debating and having scriptural quotes and going back and forth and negotiating and arguing the way that early Christians did, exactly around these ideas of how orthodoxy is constructed and heresy is constructed and how you can interpret a different text. And I feel like what Richard is describing, that some by maybe overly determining what is proper, is sort of reenacting that in a certain way. And I think, there are moments when there's an egregious kind of use of the Bible in the public square where maybe that intervention is called for. But I think when we talk about the biblical studies within the 21st century and within the United States, something I worry about is always the historical literacy as well, and how I think we have to be very interested, I come from a background in classics, and that brought me to late antiquity and early Christianity. But I think our knowledge of history as well as the Bible really go hand in hand. So that's my plug for studying other periods as well.
Maybe I can go to another a question that really deals with pedagogy, I think. And it's a question about critical mass. What happens in teaching Bible and interfaith when one or another religious tradition or no religious tradition dominates the student body? And are there also historical shifts that you may have perceived over time in your institution, from mostly Christian to mostly Muslim, or multi-faith at Hartford, from a state institution in a largely Christian context, Alabama, etc.?
I can try to jump in here. It's actually a point I was thinking about for the last question as well. There's something here that's really interesting. When I think of my colleagues, not just in this space, although it's actually a pretty good representation as well, if I think of Professor Reinhardt's in particular, who doesn't necessarily have, in her words, an invested interest in the New Testament or some kind of deep appreciation for the characters at its heart, or religiously influenced and so on. In some ways, we have an obligation as biblical scholars, like scientists do, to disclose our interests and to be very clear for the world. I mean, there are so many individuals in our world, Western world, particularly in America, that have particular perspectives in their use of the Bible. And I just want to publicly name the appalling nature of the way the Bible was held up at rallies recently, at the riots in Washington, the way the cross was processed as a Jericho march. I mean, our texts are being used by individuals in ways that are not just frightening, but violent and damaging. Even today, it's not just part of the past in coming to America, sort of crossing the Red Sea and using the book of Exodus, and seeing the new indigenous peoples of this country as the Canaanites. We kind of think of those things as in the past, but we still have people today, whether religious practitioners or just those who like to pull from the Bible because of its, for reasons that I won't get into, but we have an obligation to call those out as scholars. And maybe now to tie into the next question, I think that's true in our classrooms as well, that when we have a majority, whether it's a group that we may have our own vested interest in as a scholar, maybe as a Christian scholar myself, I see my own Christian students have certain questions. You may have Muslims who have certain questions, or Jews or others. We have an obligation to be not just as objective, but as intellectually honest as we can. And there may be moments, I actually think it's helpful for a student to see a professor, particularly in I'm going to call it faith-based, but in a confessional student, whatever we want to call it, a setting like mine where you may have students who are doing their studies in order to go out and profess their work in a religious sense. I have a duty as a scholar to admit when I can't resolve tensions in the text. I actually have a duty to problematize the text at times, and that will be different in different settings. For certain classrooms, you might have to help students see the problem of the text. I don't think it's my job necessarily to meld all of the problems I come up with in my scholarship with my own religious views on things. And some people find that very odd. Well, how do you live then? You must have some tension. It's like, no, I have some real problems with these texts, with the Canaanite texts, or whatever the issue might be, or I can't explain the authorship of a certain text. And I think having our students see us be intellectually honest, even when it might go against a larger tradition, is really important and helpful. I don't think I'm fully answering that question, but I'm hopefully addressing some of it, and I'll stop there.
Yeah, I just want to add something. I'm I'm Canadian, and I teach in Canada, but I spent a lot of time in the US, and it's always struck me that the role of the Bible in the public square, and politics in particular, is very different in our two countries. And here, it's not de rigueur, to quote from Revelation or Paul, or, you don't need to do that. Most politicians don't do that. And it's not really part of the public conversation to nearly the same degree that it is in the United States. But we consume a lot of American media. And we are interested observers from north of the border. And I would think that part of our responsibility in these days is to look at the way that the Bible is used, especially visually. The clips that we see on television, somebody holding, the president of the United States holding up the Bible in front of a church after clearing an area with tear gas, and the way that some of the, in Charlottesville, carrying around, John 8:44 and others sports games carrying placards that say John 3:16 and all of that. That it's important to really look at that and what does that express and how does that come to be? And I was thinking about this in conjunction with Richard's comment on how, do we use the language of misusing the Bible? It's, sometimes I think that it can be important to do that. And it comes down to how we really deal with questions of biblical authority. What sort of authority does the Bible have in certain contexts? What lies behind the use of certain biblical verses in particular contexts? We think also of the curse of Ham and the household codes, to support ideologies of misogyny and pro-slavery and submission and, all kinds of things like that. Now, we might not want to say that those are misusing the Bible. I don't know, maybe we do want to say that. We might want to differentiate between how the Bible becomes used in certain contexts to support certain views, and acknowledge that there are other ways of reading the Bible that didn't necessarily mean that in its historical context. But I think this is a whole mess of questions that we have to deal with in the classroom. And a lot of it comes down to challenging authority. As Joel was saying earlier on, learning biblical languages, understanding all of a sudden that there are certain manuscripts, when you first start doing this work, that there are manuscripts that disagree with each other. We don't actually know, in many cases, what the right reading is. So all of this, I think, on a contemporary sense, does have to be addressed, especially in the U.S., but also for the rest of us that, because of globalization, because of the tremendous impact of American media and culture on other parts of the world.
One reaction I had to the question, Wilhelmine, that the audience member posed was that maybe flipping it around a bit is that I think the authority in the room often, teaching this is the biblical scholar. And I think as a field, we have a long way to go, but I think there have been at least some changes towards a more diverse sort of professoriate, and we need more of that work. And I wasn't conscious of it when I was an undergrad, but I think I was a classics major, and a lot of my professors were female. Whereas I don't think I had a female religious scholar until I was in my master's program. And I do think that changes the type, because our identities are also multifaceted. And sometimes when we're talking about faith, we're also talking about, as a woman in a particular religious tradition, when I'm teaching a particular text, it has had consequences for me and my, grandmothers and women in a different way. So I think that's another way that not only are the students changing, but I think the professors, hopefully, our faculties are changing as well.
Thank you. I think this is actually a beautiful and a fitting conclusion to the panel. And I really want to thank you very much for your very animated contributions to this discussion. And unfortunately, we couldn't get all the audience questions, but we got a few good ones in. And with that, I'll turn it over to Noah, again, Noah Silverman from IFYC.
I would just like to say, again, thank you so much to each of our panelists for what was truly a stimulating and rich conversation, and we really appreciate you taking your time and sharing your insights and your wisdom with us. As I mentioned at the outset, this is part of a larger symposium we're doing on typologies of interfaith education. There will be 3 more webinars in the next week. Next one will be on Monday, January 18th, again at 4 p.m. Central Time, on pluralism and moral foundations. Then on Wednesday, we'll have a panel of seminary and divinity school administrators reflecting on where do we go from here, the future of seminary and divinity school education in a post-COVID world. And then finally, we'll conclude next Thursday, the 21st, with a panel of younger emerging scholars reflecting on their careers and their trajectories. So again, thank you to each of our panelists. Thank you to the attendees. We will be disseminating the recording and other material from the symposium once it's concluded. And I just wish everyone a lovely evening. Thank you.